So thanks everybody for joining us, and really appreciate you all for taking this extra step to be prepared to hike on the AT in 2021. So my name is Catherine Herndon Powell. I work for ATC in our Virginia regional office in Roanoke, Virginia, as education and outreach coordinator. And I'm going to pause for just a moment and let Chloe and Stephen introduce themselves.
Hi folks, my name is Chloe DeCamera. I'm ATC's Trail Education Specialist based out of our southern region in Asheville, North Carolina, and I thru hiked the AT northbound in 2015.
Hey, how's it going? My name is Stephen Aaron. I was born and raised in Durham, North Carolina, Eagle Scout. I'm the Trail Facilities Manager out of Asheville, so I get to work between Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. I also did a thru hike in 2014.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention, I'm the old one of this bunch. I did my AT thru hike way back in 2006, and I also hiked the PCT in 2010. Okay, so that's who we are. And then one more thing I want to just get to right off the bat is talking for a moment about COVID-19. So if you've been following ATC's communications at all this year, you probably know that we asked everyone to postpone their long distance hikes in 2020. And the pandemic is still ongoing. Unfortunately, it seems like there's worse news every day lately. And so we have not changed our guidance. Hiking is a form of interstate travel, and that makes it a public health risk. So the safest thing for hikers and for the communities that hikers pass through would be for everyone to continue to put off their long distance hiking plans. So you might be thinking, why are we hosting these sessions with advice for long distance hikers if we are continuing to say that it is not necessarily safe or advisable to hike the trail next year? Well, it appears that people are still going to do it. They're still going to go on long distance hikes. And we know that folks who make that choice want to be ready in all the ways that hikers have always prepared for their hikes. And also they want to take extra precautions for this new paradigm. So ATC is in a unique position to reach people who are considering a long hike with information that we hope will minimize the risk of COVID-19 outbreaks along the trail and in trailside communities. The fact that we're hosting these sessions does not mean that it's safe or advisable to hike next year. It means that we are determined to do what we can to minimize the risk. And one thing I also forgot to mention is that we're not going to be encouraging long distance hikes or recognizing them with 2,000 miler certification until there is a effective, widely available vaccine or treatment for COVID-19. All right, so with that, we are gonna jump right into a little bit of background about the Appalachian Trail. Some of this you might know already, but we just want to make sure we're all starting from the same base of knowledge. The trail is 2,193 miles, a continuous footpath all the way from Springer Mountain down in Georgia up to Katahdin in Maine. It passes through 14 states, 6 national parks, and 8 national forests. We estimate that there are about 3 to 4 million visitors that come to the Appalachian Trail every year. How is the trail managed? It is maintained, managed, and protected through the Cooperative Management System. Those are a bunch of big words. The cooperative what now? That means a partnership of 87 distinct land managers being the units of the National Park Service, the National Forests, state parks, and other public lands that the trail passes through. The 31 trail maintaining clubs. So if you look at that map on the right side of the screen, all those little logos each one represents a trail club that is responsible for a section of the trail. And those are primarily volunteers who take the responsibility to do all the day-to-day maintenance to keep the trail open and keep facilities like shelters and bridges and blazes all in working order. And of course, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, we are the national nonprofit that works in partnership with the clubs and the land management agencies. So how does stewardship of the trail happen? Well, the main workforce is over 6,000 volunteers every year who give over 200,000 hours of labor. So the lucky folks like me and Chloe and Stephen that get to work for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and our partners in the Forest Service, Park Service, and other public lands are a tiny workforce in comparison to the volunteers who give their time freely. And the trail was built by, conceived by volunteers as well. So we can't emphasize their role too much. And since we are talking about COVID-19, I also would like to mention that the average age of an AT volunteer is pretty high. It's primarily folks who are retired because that's who has the time to do a lot of volunteering. So that means that a lot of our volunteer corps are at high risk when it comes to COVID-19. Okay, so we're talking about long distance hikes in general. Long distance hike is anything, where you are going to need to resupply, where you can't just get back to your car at the end. So section hikes and through hikes, but we're going to go over some really basic 3 categories of through hikes. There is the most traditional one being the northbound hike, starting at Springer Mountain down in Georgia and continuing north to Katahdin. We do recommend starting SMART at the Arch at Amicalola Falls State Park if you're going to do that. The start dates, you can start anytime between February and May. It is extra busy and crowded from early March through early April. And you have about depending when you start, you have about 4 to 6 months to complete it by the time you get to, by the time they're closing down things up in Katahdin and Baxter State Park. On a southbound hike, of course, is the opposite of that. You start up at Katahdin in Baxter State Park and you hike south to Springer Mountain. That means you're going to be starting on the most difficult climb of the whole Appalachian Trail and heading pretty quickly into the most difficult terrain in southern Maine and New Hampshire. You can start in June, sometime June through July. That changes every year. We can't predict it because it depends on the weather conditions up on Katahdin. And again, you have about 4 to 6 months to complete before you're going to run into some pretty hairy weather in the Smokies and the Nantahala. And then there's the flip-flop hike. And the flip-flop hike is the choose your own adventure option. You can start anywhere on the trail. You can finish where you like. You can start anytime April through June. It could take 6 to 8 months or even more to complete it, depending how you do it. The most common way to do a flip-flop hike is to start in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, which is the psychological halfway point of the trail. It's also where ATC's headquarters is, and hike continuously north, perhaps all the way to Katahdin, or some folks like to stop leave themselves to the 100-mile wilderness in Katahdin for the very end. Then you can flip back to Harpers Ferry and hike south to Springer, or you could flip all the way down to Springer and come back to Harpers Ferry. There's all sorts of options. Okay, so now I'm gonna pause for a minute or two, and I'd like everybody to just reflect on what your desired experience is for your hike. Maybe think about what it looks like, what the weather is like, who's around, what is a nice night in camp sound like, look like, smell like, I don't know. And if you want to jot something down for yourself, that's great. Or if you are comfortable doing so, you're welcome to share that reflection in the chat box. Okay, and while you guys are sharing those reflections, here's a little bit of ATC's data on through hiking. So I'll first call out the top orange red line there. That's the data we have on attempted through hikes starting in Georgia. You see something interesting happening there in 1998, 99, and 2000, a really rapid increase in the number of hikers starting out at Springer. That's not necessarily reflected in the corresponding increase in successful completions of the trail. So go ahead and take a guess for me, share it in the chat. What do you think was going on there in 1998, 99, 2000? And while y'all are sharing those guesses, I'll just interpret the rest of the chart for you. The green line that we have the most data on going back to 1990 there is the folks who actually reported successful completions of a through hike to ATC. The blue line at the bottom is through hikers who started a southbound hike in Maine. So that's data that we get from Baxter State Park. And we have a shorter yellow line over there on the far right-hand side because we've only been collecting this information for 5 years. That is folks who intended to start a flip-flop hike, and they registered with us when we first started our voluntary registration system in 2015. That has now become the AT Camp registration system, which we're going to talk about a little bit more soon. Okay, so lots of good guesses coming in. I will confirm that the reason why we had a big spike of interest in hiking northbound on the AT starting in 1998 is that Bill Bryson's best-selling book, A Walk in the Woods was first published in 1997. So that's kind of when through hiking, the Appalachian Trail as a phenomenon became part of mainstream culture. And then you see there's a bit of a dip, but starting in 2008, we've had an increase in northbound through hike attempts every single year ever since. I will share, so I want you guys to look at this chart, think about it and compare the numbers of folks, almost 4,000 folks the past few years trying to start in Georgia, and most of them trying to start in March and April, can lead to some extremely crowded conditions at campsites throughout the South, but especially in Georgia and Nantahala. I will share that when I hiked in 2006, which is actually like the low point of this curve. As you see, I didn't know it at the time. It seemed very crowded to me in Georgia. I had several nights where I could not find a good campsite, wound up camping on some really steep, uncomfortable slopes. One night my whole tent got flooded, and it was in the middle of like a gross ice storm because I had to camp at the bottom of a drainage, which was the only spot I could find. So if it was like that in 2006, imagine what it was like in 2019 and how that might contrast with what your desired experience is. If your desired experience had anything to do with solitude and hearing the sounds of nature and time to think and reflect and enjoy the view, you might not have as much of that if you start northbound in the spring. A few other things we want to point out to consider as you're considering your itinerary: terrain. Again, if you start on a southbound hike, you're going to be heading right into the most challenging terrain that I believe is a photo from Mahoosic Notch in southern Maine. Crowds. This is a classic shot from the spring in the Smokies. Consider that no matter how committed you may be to being COVID safe, when you're cold and wet and verging on hypothermia, a shelter is going to be very attractive, even if there's other people there. And if you go in when there's no one in there, you might be joined by other people because it's raining and they want to get out of the rain. So I hope that shelters don't look like this in 2021, but there's no promises. We can't predict. All right, and then weather. There is a misconception that because Georgia is in the deep South, if you go down there in March or April, it's going to be a whole lot warmer than other parts of the country. That is not the case in the mountains that the Appalachian Trail passes through. These are pictures from the Smokies in March and in May. So even if you pick a later start date, does not mean that you will necessarily be able to avoid snow and freezing conditions and some very cold nights. So the things that folks often focus on when they are trying to pick out their itinerary is their budget and where they want to finish. And I'm not going to try and convince anybody that Katahdin is not a beautiful, amazing, iconic into your journey. Just maybe consider that you can do a flip-flop hike and still finish on Katahdin. You could save it for last. The budget consideration is that, if you flip-flop, you need to budget a little bit more for your transportation costs to get around. But I will also argue that in 2021, with COVID being a concern, you should have a lot of extra wiggle room in your budget for transportation, for unexpected stays, quarantine, perhaps in a hotel. You just shouldn't be embarking on a hike if you're not ready to adjust to the situations at hand financially. All right, and I really would love to talk a whole lot about Leave No Trace. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, but we're trying to keep this presentation tight. So I'm just going to share with you these 7 principles, and we will send along a link to ATC's webpage about Leave No Trace. I recommend watching some of our short little fun videos on the Don't Be That Guy series that kind of highlight some of the most important things to be aware of in terms of Leave No Trace on the Appalachian Trail. Leave No Trace, of course, is all about minimizing your impact on the environment around you and minimizing your impact on the experience of other visitors. So I'm not going to read all 7 of these principles, but I encourage you to become familiar with them. And I'm just going to call out a couple things. Number 1, you need to learn how to dig a cat hole for your human waste. So that means you need to go 200 feet, which is about 70 steps for most adults, away from water and away from campsites and trails. and dig yourself a 6 to 8 inch hole, you are not going to be able to do it well with the back of your foot or with a stick. You're going to need to carry a trowel to do it right, especially when you really got to go. You're going to want to have the right tool. And that is especially important during COVID-19 because while there are privies along the trail, consider that those privies are much higher risk in terms of potential coronavirus transmission. And another thing we really want to emphasize is food storage. We've had increasing incidents of human-bear conflicts over the past few years, generally caused by hikers who did not store their food properly and caused bears to get acclimated to human food. So we recommend the bear canister as the very best way, or an Ursack, also as long as you know how to use the Ursack and tie it up correctly. It takes a little more learning than a canister. Canister is super easy. And if you don't have one of those, then we recommend that you definitely hang your food 12 feet high every night. And remember that, you've got to do it every night. The one night that you don't guard your food correctly, you could be fatal to the bear. A fed bear is a dead bear, and you're also going to be creating a huge nuisance for all the hikers who come behind you. Okay, moving on to logistics. There's a lot of things to think about when you're considering all your logistics for your thru hike. Be aware that regulations vary. As we mentioned, the trail goes through 87 different jurisdictions of different land management agencies. And so there are places where you can camp anywhere you like. Most of the South, you're on national forest land where you can camp where you like, you can have a campfire where you like, but then there are other areas like Great Smoky Mountains National Park or the White Mountains up in New Hampshire where camping is restricted and campfires are restricted. There are places like the entire state of New Jersey, you are not allowed to have a campfire. So you need to know those rules. Dogs are not allowed in the Smokies or in Baxter State Park. There are 3 places on the trail where you need to get a permit. That is this Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Shenandoah National Park, and Baxter. At least for the Smokies and for Baxter State Park, we definitely recommend getting those permits in advance before you arrive. And you should be aware that the Smokies permit does cost $20. That's the only one that comes with a fee. Thinking about transportation for this COVID-19 era is really a tricky thing to think about. Hikers often might hitchhike or rely on rides from locals, which was never an especially safe thing to do. Unfortunately, there have been some crimes and issues associated with that, but especially in COVID-19 times, enclosed vehicle is very easy way for the virus to be transmitted. So we're just gonna recommend that you think through your options with transportation and really, if you wear a mask, absolutely. If you're riding in somebody's car, ask them to wear a mask if they're comfortable. Maybe if it's a stranger, maybe take a picture of their license plate so that you have some information about them and you can text it to somebody back home real quick. Just be really careful with your transportation, both in terms of COVID safety and general safety. And here's the big thing, ding, 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 ding. Please, especially this year, register your hike at atcamp.org. atcamp.org is our voluntary registration system that has primarily been used by thru hikers to indicate their start date over the past 5 years. This year, we're really asking folks to use it for a hike of any length on the Appalachian Trail because it will help everyone see how crowded a particular campsite might be on a particular night. Here's how ATCamp works. You go to the website, atcamp.org, and you'll be able to access charts like this. And this chart is showing you how many other people have indicated their intention to start on that date, on a given date. And the red line is our estimated capacity for campsites. So if more than 38 people start at Amacola Falls State Park on a given day, persons number 39 through infinity are unlikely to be able to find a campsite. And this number does take into account that no one should be sleeping in the shelters this year because of COVID. I have a couple little user tips for atcamp.org for when you get there. Be aware that it is easier to do on a computer screen, but totally doable on a phone if you have a simple thru hike itinerary. Do check those charts first to help you find a less busy day. You'll notice that there are always some dates, like everyone thinks it's hilarious to start on April Fool's Day. Folks tend to cluster up around weekends, Saturdays and Sundays, because it might be a convenient time for their friends and family to drop them off. But consider that if you're hiking for several months, there's nothing wrong with starting on a Tuesday, and it might mean that you have a much better experience in terms of spreading folks out. So the atcamp.org is all about spreading folks out. Look at those charts before you pick your start date. And remember that a registration is not a reservation. You're still going to need to get your permits for the Smokies, for Shenandoah, and for Baxter. And the fact that you registered does not mean that you have a guaranteed campsite when you arrive. You cannot change your registration once you've made it. So do check your inbox, look at the junk folder if you don't see it. You'll get an email after you register that has an order number in it. And if you need to change your registration, you're just going to want to go ahead and cancel that one. You'll need that order number to cancel it. And then you can go back and just create yourself a new registration. Thru hikers do not need to select campsites. It's great if you do, then other folks can see that where you plan to camp. But all other hikers, if you're doing a section hike or group hike, we do ask that you select your campsites. Now we're going to talk about safety in general, and then safety as it relates to COVID-19. A little bit of general safety. Always listen to your gut. If someone is making you feel uncomfortable, if a situation seems unsafe, listen to that feeling, get out of there, look out for others that might be around you, and report incidents to the ATC at AppalachianTrail.org. We share that information with National Park Service, with law enforcement, and it's very useful. What do we mean when we say an incident? An incident does not have to be a crime. If there's an actual crime or emergency going on, obviously you should dial 911. But an incident might be a situation like that where someone made you feel uncomfortable or unsafe, just something that didn't feel right. Or some kind of damage like resource damage, somebody's chopping down trees or something like that. Always share your itinerary with somebody and check in regularly with them at home. So hopefully you've got somebody who's not on the trail who will be expecting you to check in at regular intervals and will be wondering where you are if they don't hear back from you. And they should have your itinerary, and be following it closely enough that they are going to know about where you are if you are to go missing. Please consider carrying a satellite communication device, such as a spot device or an inReach device. That is a way that you can communicate in a scenario where your cell phone does not have service or maybe the battery dies. A little word about firearms. So if you're considering carrying a firearm on the trail, keep in mind that you are going to need to do a lot of research about all of those different lands that you pass through, federal lands, state lands. You're going to need licenses and permits to be carrying that firearm that are valid everywhere. And it's also heavy, and you're going to need to secure it at night when you're sleeping and at all times. So we often recommend for folks who might be considering bringing a firearm on the trail because they're concerned about other people or about bears, that you could have that same sense of safety and ability to defend yourself with bear spray, which is heavy duty pepper spray. So we do recommend that as a good alternative to carrying a firearm. Also, stay on top of the weather forecast and hazards such as severe storms. Every time you have the opportunity to check the weather forecast, it's a good idea. And that's all. Sorry, I thought I had one more on that page. Okay, now talking a little bit about COVID-19. So I have another prompt for you guys to guess in the chat. What might be some essential PPE for the COVID-19 era on the Appalachian Trail? PPE stands for personal protective equipment. I do have a little clue there in the image on the slide. So yes, a face covering. Please keep a spare face mask. I recommend a disposable one in your first aid kit where it's going to stay nice and dry and clean. That is because you want to think about situations not only where you might require first aid, but where you might be giving first aid to somebody else. You're going to want to be ready for both of you to be wearing a mask. So if you were to try and help somebody who did not have a mask, it'd be great to have one right there in your first aid kit where you can ask them to put it on before you administer any type of first aid. By the way, we always recommend going through a wilderness first aid course if you're able to before you go on a long distance hike on the trail. And please wear those face coverings, face masks whenever you are in town, especially. It's great to have it with you at all times. Anytime you might be within 6 feet of somebody, just go ahead and put it on, whether you're on outdoors or not. But especially as you go into AT communities, please wear a face mask at all time. Please hold other hikers accountable to the same standard of safety. Another item that you might not have thought of that counts as personal protective equipment this year on the Appalachian Trail is your personal shelter, your tent, your hammock, your bivvy, your tarp, whatever system you're going to use to sleep in. That is your personal protective equipment, because we do not recommend sleeping in the shelters. That is going to mean that you are sharing airspace and aerosols and breathing the same air as strangers who are not members of your household. Consider that even if the shelter is empty when you arrive, somebody else might arrive. They might arrive really late. So when it's raining, you're going to be tempted to go in there, but we recommend you just steer clear of the shelters altogether. And keep that personal shelter, have a good one, so that if, even if it's just a wet, rainy day and you want a dry place to eat lunch, you can pop your tent or your tarp up. You're going to want a trowel and some kind of hand washing kit or hand sanitizer. That is crucial because, as we mentioned, the privies are not cleaned regularly. They're not disinfected. So we do not recommend using the privies. Having a trowel and knowing how to dig that 6 to 8 inch cat hole, 70 steps, 200 feet away from water is really going to help you stay safe, and it's going to help us avoid an issue with lots of, surface deposits of human waste all the way from Georgia to Maine. So everybody needs to be doing that. You can wash your hands with soap in the backcountry. Please use biodegradable soap and do not introduce that soap into a water source. You should do it away from the water source, use your water that you're carrying and scatter it as you're able. The bottle, if you look closely on those bottles of campsites, they say don't use it in a creek or a lake or a spring. It's not where it belongs. Think through your resupply and town visits very carefully. This might be a year to try and carry a little extra food so you can go a little farther in between town visits. In general, on a normal year, most hikers go into town every 3 to 4 days. This year might be a good idea to try and stretch that out a little longer, even if it makes your pack a little heavier, because every time you go into town, you need to think through every point of contact that you're going to have with other people, from the ride that gets you there into town to where you're sleeping at night, where you're doing your laundry, where you're getting your groceries, the post office if you're getting mail. Every single one of those is a potential place for you to either be transmitting or receiving the coronavirus. So think through how you can minimize how many times you go into town, and when you're there, how you can be as safe as possible. And please wear face masks. Please use hand sanitizer, wash your hands, and maintain social distance from anybody you see, and stay outside as much as possible. All the stuff the CDC has been recommending we do since March. And again, with sanitation, that's just mentioning what I had mentioned before about using a trowel to dig a cat hole when you need to go to the bathroom, and having a good hand washing system with hand sanitizer or biodegradable soap. All right, and just a word about gear. There are a ton of resources out there. We are not gonna get too deep into what you should carry, exactly how much your pack should weigh, because you can find that all over the internet, and lots more great information on ATC's website as well. Just a few basic tips. You're gonna wanna spend most of your time and your money figuring out the big three: your backpack, your sleeping system, that's the sleeping bag and sleeping pad or a quilt, whatever you're doing, and your shelter. And ideally you want to shoot for about 3 pounds each for those. So that's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck if you're going to buy, lighter weight equipment. Again, please carry a trowel and please make sure you've got a good food storage system, whether that's a bear canister and earth sack or your cord and carabiner to hang your food. Again, we most recommend the bear canister. And don't forget your face mask, your face covering. Recommend having multiple masks so that when one gets wet and dirty, you have a clean one to put on, and your hand sanitizer or your hand washing kit. We recommend that you shoot for a fully loaded pack weight of less than 25% of your body weight, and do a shakedown hike of at least 3 days, 2 nights, or longer. so you can see how the pack feels, see how all your equipment works, and you get bonus points if you can do the opposite of what most folks do when they go backpacking for a few days and try to go during cold and rainy weather. So you really see how your rain gear holds up. Okay, that is our whole presentation. I haven't been able to see the chat to see all the great conversation that I hope has been going on. So I'm going to leave this screen up for just a moment, so folks are welcome to jot down my email address if you want to follow up. But I will pass it over to Chloe and Stephen, who have hopefully been keeping a list of any questions that they weren't able to get to in the chat to answer here right out loud.
I think we got to most of the questions that we saw so far. Great questions, y'all. Thank you so much for participating. I just want to second Catherine's last bit of advice of doing a test hike with whatever gear you choose to use, because if you get 10 thru hikers in a room, you're going to have 10 different gear setups. So it's really what works for you and what's that Goldilocks, like, just right feeling. And then, yeah, choose the crummiest weather that you can possibly find. It's not fun, but if you get out there and you stay warm, you know you have a good setup of gear. Stephen, do you have anything you wanted to add?
No, yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. Give everything a shot. There's a thru hike can seem like one thing in your mind, and it can be a totally other beast, especially on a bad day. So if you have a backyard or a friend's backyard, try to sleep out there, especially in the wintertime. Just test things out. So
we have one question, Catherine. If we do complete a thru hike next year, will it not be recognized as a 2,000 miler at all, or can we apply for the certificate once a vaccine is out?
Yeah, so we stopped recognizing miles hiked toward a 2,000 miler certificate on March 31st of this year. And so any miles that have been hiked after March 31st, 2020, currently will not be recognized by ATC for our 2,000 miler certification. And so we don't know yet when we'll be able to start recognizing miles again, but it's not going to happen until there's a widely available vaccine. So any miles that you were to go out and hike today, for instance, would not count towards the 2,000 mile certificate. And then another one that just popped up, where do you put your backpack at night? I keep it personally in my tent. Sometimes if you've got a really tight little tent, you might hang it on a tree nearby. And I do know some folks will hang it, if they're doing a bear hang and hanging their food at night, some folks hang the whole pack up there. So those are some good options. A tent with a vestibule is really great. So you can have your pack not in your tent space with you. Personally, I like to elevate my feet. So I kind of built myself a little ramp with my pack at night to prop my feet up on.
I would also just make sure there's no food in any of your pockets. I have a bad habit of eating granola bars or a Snickers bar and then putting that in my side pocket of my backpack. And then once I'm super, super cozy and warm, I look at my backpack and I have to go all the way back out to my my food hang or my bear canister and put that trash in there. So just make that part of your nightly ritual to check every single pocket on your person and on your backpack before you put it in your tent. So how difficult is climbing Katahdin? I think, Mike, that depends on which direction you're going. If you're going northbound and it's your last hike of a 2,000 plus mile journey, then it's still challenging. It's still the hardest hike of the entire Appalachian Trail, and it's hand over foot climbing. They actually blast rebarb into the rock and make a ladder out of it. So you're no longer hiking, you're mountaineering, and it is really fun if you're a northbounder because you have so much adrenaline. I just felt like I was scrambling up the mountain the whole time I was going up there. Southbounders, I think, have still an exciting experience, but it might be more physically challenging because they don't have their hiking legs. And I just had a former ridge runner that I used to work with. She and her husband went up to Maine a couple of years ago and did it as a day hike. And she said it was the hardest hike she's ever done in her life because she went from Couch to Katahdin. So it just depends on where you're at physically and mentally, and also what the weather is like. Are there any super sketchy sections of the trail, not difficulty-wise, but easy to fall or get hurt? Yes. Catherine or Stephen, if you want to jump in, I think there are definitely some areas where there's a steep side hill, and that you need to be careful of your footing. There could be areas like in Pennsylvania where there's a lot of loose rock where you can easily trip. I definitely fell flat on my face one time walking through Pennsylvania, but Catherine and Stephen, I'll let you guys add to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy enough to fall around the house. I'd expect if you're gonna walk 2,000 miles, you can expect to fall a good couple times. I would suggest trekking poles because that certainly kept me from falling on my face a handful of times. Rather than what you might see out west with a trail with a lot of run out, rather in particular where you might fall for a very long period of time, we're a lot more vegetated. It's a lot bigger of a trail, a lot bigger side hills. So I wouldn't say that we have as big of dangerous of sections to a lot of other places. It really just more than anything comes down to having good footwear and paying attention to how you're fueling yourself, because towards the end of the day, you will find yourself more stumbling, mumbling, doing all those things. And I guarantee you're more likely to fall if you have not had enough water or food specifically, or towards the end of the day.
I see a question asking if we anticipate more hikers in 2021 due to those who postponed their 2020 hikes. Honestly, that is part of why we are interested to see what happens now that we've just opened up the AT camp registration system, because I'm going to say I don't think we really know what to expect. When is the best time of year to hike in Maine and New Hampshire? I am down here in the South in Virginia, but I'm going to say that I think that, yeah, August, September, October. October's getting pretty cold. August is really nice.
See, now we're just getting into like different types because Stephen's like,
No. Okay, so I lived up in Maine for a couple months, not to trump y'all. September, because the foliage peaks a lot sooner. Feel free anyone in the New England to trump me, but because it peaks a lot sooner. August, you got some black flies and some Lyme disease that be going high. I don't know. I guess Chloe, you spent some time up in Vermont, but.
Well, I went through Maine in August, went on my through hike, and I didn't have a single black fly, and I did have prime beach conditions for swimming around in the lakes, although they do have a lot of, what are the things that suck on you? Leeches?
Leeches.
Yeah, there are a lot of leeches in those waters. So, it's pros and cons. I would say universally, April, May, June, not great times for New Hampshire and Maine, because that is intense black flies, and you might have a couple stragglers, but I would say August, September.
Hiking boots are a good pair of trail runners. Now let's all weigh in. I actually did my through hike, I know, back in the dark ages, 2006, in boots, and I love boots, but I know I'm in the minority there. I did the PCT in trail runners, so I definitely hike in both, but I still like my trail runners to have like a really stiff sole for those rocky sections. How about you guys?
I through hiked in over the ankle boots, which I loved because they were already broken in. I did get all of the skin of my Achilles tendon rubbed off towards the end of my hike. So I no longer hike in boots, and I hike in trail runners, but I do like that same supportive low ankle trail runner. I'm not trying to hike in running shoes. I want to hike in hiking shoes that have no ankle support.
I hiked in 6 different pairs of shoes, all with a diversity of runners, trail runners that were not waterproof at all, some that were waterproof, and then higher up boots. Really find what you like. Shoes are really personal. What works for my best friend is a style of shoe and a brand that just does not fit my foot at all and never will. I've got a handsome cankle, so.
Yeah, I'm gonna, just to contrast with what you said, Stephen, I made it all the way to Massachusetts in my first pair of boots on the AT, but I did have 6 or 7 pairs of shoes on the PCT when I was wearing, and that's just completely different terrain, different kettle of fish, but I did do a long hike in trail runners and had to be replacing them all the time. Lyme disease is a concern. Are we seeing a lot of it? Yes. There is, I don't have it at my fingertips, but there's a pretty scary map out there showing the prevalence of Lyme disease with the AT laid over, where Lyme disease occurs. Pretty much all up and down the East Coast. Of course, it started mostly in New England, but we've got it pretty much everywhere now. So I am going to say I absolutely recommend permethrin and spraying your clothes, because it's great to carry DEET. You're probably going to want to spray yourself with DEET on when you go through sections where there's a ton of mosquitoes, but you're not going to be like every single day, let me spray myself with DEET bug spray in the morning and have those oils all over my skin and stuff. Whereas you're with the permethrin, you can treat your clothes with it once, and most of those sprays will last about 20 washes or more. And you can really, I like to really go heavy on things like socks and like the seat of my pants, because I know I'm going to be sitting on the ground, just anywhere that might be kind of crawly access for ticks. I did have Lyme disease on the trail way back in 2006, so it happens to a lot of folks.
Will most hostels be operating in 2021? So I think we don't know. I think it's important for the hiker to keep an eye on the hostels that are historically operating and reach out to them. It's hard for ATC to keep up with every business along the AT, and so many things are changing, whether it be the case number of COVID or state regulations and in terms of quarantining. So I think you really have to do some homework and keep up to date on that. So I would be remiss if I didn't throw my boss under the bus at one point and ask him to make a guest appearance right now. Morgan, do you anticipate any parts of the trail closing because of COVID like earlier this year?
Yeah, I was just writing a note about that. We don't know yet, of course. We will be having ongoing regular meetings with our trail management partners, federal partners and state partners and AT clubs. At the moment, the only closures are AT shelters and privies throughout the national forests in the south, and AT shelters for Appalachian National Scenic Trail administered lands from Northern Virginia up to Baxter State Park. You know, nobody wants to close anything if we can avoid it, but it's possible. If you do decide to hike and register through AT Camp, please sign up for the alerts, and if things change, we will certainly send out an alert that tells you that there's a closure or that a closure has been rescinded. And also on ATC's website, there will be updates when things change.
I saw a question about shuttles and whether or not the Thru Hiker's Guide was the best source of information about them. Thru Hiker's Guide, generally we see the same information listed in the Thru Hiker's Guide, the Thru Hiker's Companion, and all the guidebooks, as well as I always recommend having the Guthook app, even if you don't use it very often, as your like primary way to navigate. That's an app you can have on your phone. You can see the comments, so folks are able to put comments in about like, oh, this water source dried up, or things like that. And often they will, if you look at a specific town, that's where the shuttle drivers will be listed, and there may be comments about like, hey, I called so and so, and they're no longer operating. So that might be a way. Of course, those guidebooks, the actual printed guidebooks, go to print, in like December, January. So things can change, after the guidebook's already been printed. How much time ahead do you need to register on hikes on AT Hike? Just go ahead and do it today. No, just the earlier is the better, because it does let other people know how many other folks are planning to start on a given day. If you really don't know your plans yet, then it is kind of a hassle to make a registration and then have to cancel it over and over again. But if you have a general idea, you might want to go ahead and do it. All right. Well, thank you guys all so much for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful Thursday evening. Stay safe.